Joining me now is Paul Butler. He's a former federal prosecutor and an MSNBC legal analyst who, along with, and by the way, also with us is Jennifer Rubin. She's an opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst, the author of the book Resistance, How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us this morning. Jen Rubin, this makes us wonder whether the only way to deal with Donald Trump and prevent him from becoming the next president of the United States, short of people voting that way in November, is some sort of a political answer, something that the Republican Party does as opposed to something that the courts do. What's your sense of it?
Well, they are headed for, just as you said, Ollie, the map that you pointed out is critical. He could well wrap up the nomination and then be convicted. The most likely scenario is that he will accumulate a majority of the delegates either on Super Tuesday or shortly thereafter when that criminal case begins. Jack Smith has an excellent case. The decision that you referenced from Judge Chutkan kind of puts him on a guide path to that trial. I don't think the D.C. Circuit is going to overturn. They, as you noted, in a parallel civil case, rejected this immunity defense. And I don't think the Supreme Court is going to get involved at this stage. So that means he's going on trial in March, could be convicted by or maybe even after the GOP convention in the summer. And then what do they do? Do they have a backup plan? Do they have a plan B? I don't think so. So the person he chooses for VP may become very important, or they may need to think about some mechanism by which the candidates or perhaps the body at the convention kind of do a redo in the convention. So we are really headed for uncharted territory here.
Paul, let's talk about a couple things that Jen just mentioned. First of all, she says, I don't know that the Supreme Court will get involved. It's 2023. I never know about the Supreme Court. On the other hand, we do know that the Republican primaries and caucuses that I laid out are dates that are pretty much set in stone. The court dates are not dates that are set in stone. And there's some discussion amongst legal circles that there may be valid reasons why Tanya Chutkan may grant the Trump team some delays in the federal trial, the Jack Smith trial, so that may not actually get started first. We may actually be into July or August and the Georgia trial before we get to that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think of the four trials, the one that's most likely to go first remains the federal election interference case right here in the District of Columbia with Judge Chutkan. Judge Chutkan wrote a scholarly, learned opinion this week that was written in order to withstand the inevitable appeal. So this was about the issue of immunity. Trump has been making this extreme claim that he can't be sued in civil court or prosecuted in criminal court for anything that he did when he was president. Two different courts shut that argument down this week. And I agree with Jennifer. I don't think the Supreme Court is likely to take up that case. What I am more concerned about, though, is this upcoming opinion about the gag order. I think that there's a good chance that if Trump loses that the Supreme Court would take up that case. And the Supreme Court moves on its own schedule. And so It's possible that if that couldn't be resolved until after the before the election, that even the federal election interference case would happen after the election.
You called Judge Chutkan's ruling scholarly and learned. It's also remarkably accessible. People know I'm sort of partial to reading these things, but it's a very easy read, and I would recommend to my readers, my viewers, that you go out there and you read this. It's 48 pages, and it lays it out very, very clearly that being president is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for after you're president. If you committed crimes, while president or not while president, you are the same as everybody else. Jen, last week you wrote an op-ed titled "It's Nikki Haley or Bust for the GOP." I just want to read a little bit from it. The question is whether if she managed to topple Trump, she would break with the MAGA cult of personality, decline to bow and scrape before Russian President Vladimir Putin, decline to weaponize the Justice Department against her enemies, and return to some version of normal Republican politics. All indications suggest that, yes, she would refrain from subverting constitutional democracy if she somehow won the nomination and went on to win the presidency, end quote. I had Stuart Stevens on yesterday who said otherwise. He said she's not She does not seem prepared to fully stand up to that Trump cult of people who believe that the 2020 election was overturned. Are you fairly certain you think that she'd go back to the normal Nikki Haley that we knew as governor of South Carolina?
Well, we can speculate all we like. The proof would be in the pudding. But here's the problem that she would have. Even if she personally doesn't think that Trump lost the election, she doesn't believe in a lot of this hooey, consider the party that she would be riding into the White House on. If she wins the White House, there's a good chance that the House and the Senate would be in Republican hands as well. So she will be under tremendous pressure. So perhaps the real question is not whether she would break with the MAGA Republicans if she had her druthers, but what that dynamic would be between House Republicans, the Mike Johnsons of the world, the Jim Jordans of the world, and Nikki Haley, who might, should she have her druthers, want to return to some normal politics. So I think it's an open question, obviously. I tend to think of those left in the race, she's probably the only one who could possibly beat him. Ron DeSantis has essentially crashed and burned. There's no one else who's rising up. So it's either going to be Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, or, they're going to have a chaos at the convention. So buckle up.
Well, when you talked about who his vice presidential candidate is, I immediately thought, Vivek Ramaswamy is really running for that job. So if Vivek Ramaswamy becomes the vice presidential candidate and Donald Trump goes to jail, we might be in a whole different set of pickles. Paul Butler, let's talk about Georgia. Scott McAfee, the judge there, Steve Sadow, Trump's attorney, who made the argument that any kind of trial, if Trump is campaigning to be the president of the United States, this trial would at best start in July or August and maybe later. Trump might then be the nominee, or at least might have enough votes to be the nominee. Any trial then would constitute election interference, which means he couldn't have a trial until after the election. But if he were to win as president, he couldn't have a trial until after he was president, putting the start date of the possible trial in Georgia at January 20th, 2029. Don't know what Judge McAfee is going to do about that, but didn't sound like he was taking the bait on that argument.
Yeah, so it's certainly not the case that this trial would count as election interference if, in fact, it happens before the election. What is probably correct is that if Donald Trump wins the presidency and the trial in Fulton County hasn't started, it wouldn't start until after he left office. And I think the judge knows this, and I think the judge is trying to rush this trial. We know that 4 of the 19 defendants have pled guilty. It's quite likely that many, many others will also plead guilty. Fani Willis has suggested that she won't accept a plea bargain from Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, or the former president. So we could be looking at really just the 3 of them in a trial. And I think it's quite possible that that could happen before the election with a concerted effort. Really interesting that Judge McAfee suggested that Fani Willis and Jack Smith, who ordinate, especially on discovery issues. Right now, there's a court order preventing the lawyers in the federal election interference case from sharing documents with anybody else. Judge Chutkan might allow that sharing, which would allow both federal election interference and Fani Willis's trial to proceed more quickly.